Ladies and gentlemen, we are heading now into our active program as we are tackling the hottest topics of the industry these days. And for your questions, please feel free, of course, to shoot your questions along via the Slido QR code, which is now on display. So that's the reason, and that's the excuse when you're allowed to have your cell phone in your hand, or if you tweet a nice post with the hashtag ITB Berlin or ITB Berlin Convention. So please feel free to, save that QR code and, of course, send us and submit your questions that are keeping you busy day and night from the travel and the tourism industry. Coming up now, ladies and gentlemen, more insights on the global economy in times of transformation and what it means for the tourism industries. And for that, I welcome now the holder of the Chair of Tourism and Head of the Center for Entrepreneurship at the Catholic University Eichstätt-Ingolstadt. Please welcome Harald Pechlaner.
Thank you, Katie. Wonderful. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, dear experts. Professor Quack was announcing the key expression, mastering transformation. This should be the key expression for the ITB Convention. And there is a really well-known expert, Professor Clemens Fuest, talking now about global economy and the great transformation. So we will discuss about transformation. What kind of transformation and in what way the transformation will influence tourism and hospitality industry. We are proud to be able to announce Professor Clemens Fuest. We all know him. He is the president of the IFO Institute, the Leibniz Institute for Economic Research at the University of Munich. He is the director of the Center for Economic Studies, CES, at the University of Munich, and in that position also a professor of economics at the University of Munich. He was also professor of business taxation at the University of Oxford, professor at the University of Mannheim. He was a member and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors at the German Federal Ministry of Finance. Well, he had a lot of positions and roles in his business life, and today he is here to talk about the global transformation, the global economy, the relations between global economy and the great transformations, and obviously giving us an outlook and implications for the tourism industry. I'd like to welcome Professor Clemens Fuest.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Mastering transformation, I think this is an idea which, if it has a presence for this industry. So this industry has gone through very difficult times and through transformative times even more than the rest of the economy. So what I'd like to talk about today is the state of the global economy. Are we finally getting out of these crises? And I would like to relate this to the transformations, not the transformations we've undergone during the pandemic and all these difficult years, but the more slow-moving transformations like the move towards sustainability, climate change, demographic change, digitization, and you know them all. So I'd like to talk about 4 points. First of all, an economic outlook. Are we facing something like a shallow recession or no recession at all? Then a few words about this transformation. Starting by asking how have we managed these transformations today. We've been so busy thinking about how we survive in the pandemic. We've been so busy thinking about how we survive in the energy crisis that we've maybe had less time to think about how we get through these transformations that are more slow-moving, like climate change, adaptations to sustainability, labor shortages coming on as a result of demographic change and, as I mentioned, digitization. And now as we work with these transformations, we are hit by the current crisis and in particular the most recent crisis, the energy crisis. And I would like to very briefly talk about how this new shock after the pandemic affects the way in which we deal with these transformations. And then a couple of conclusions, couple of thoughts for this industry. What does it all mean for the future of this industry? Now, let's take a look at the current economic outlook. This is the GDP growth and growth forecasts for a couple of countries in the coming years. Now, the blue bars are economic growth after the pandemic hit in 2020. So economic growth in 2021, this was a recovery. And then in 2022, everybody was hoping the recovery was continuing, but it didn't because of the shock of the Ukraine war. And the yellow bars are expected growth for 2023. And you see it's going down. If you look at Europe, the yellow bar is particularly small. So Europe is hit most hardly by the current crisis. To some extent, the way in which countries are hit is related to their proximity, their geographical proximity to Russia, unsurprisingly, because that also determines their energy dependence on Russia. And the hope here, the green bar, is that in 2024 things will get better. Let's take a look at Germany, the biggest economy in the Eurozone, but also one which is characteristic at what's going on in Europe at the moment. So what you see here is the Ifo Business Climate Index. It's an indicator of economic activity. And so for this indicator, we ask companies, what is your current state of affairs of business and what do you expect for the next 6 months? And the blue line here is what the answer to the question, what companies expect for the next 6 months. And you see you see the pandemic here, the hit of the pandemic, and then you see the blue bar really went down in the autumn. So companies got very pessimistic in the autumn. And then in October, November, things started to recover. What was really going on, the current business situation up here was never so bad, but everybody was expecting things to get worse, okay? But, when the index was here, we were wondering, is the black line going down here or is the blue line coming up? Now, fortunately, the blue line seems to be coming up. So there is some good news. Of course, that good news is related to the fact that we have avoided a gas rationing scenario and gas prices are even declining. We were lucky because temperatures were mild and China, due to its slowdown, bought less LNG. So we have avoided a gas rationing scenario. And that has contributed to this improvement. If we look at different parts of the economy, I don't want to talk about that for a long time, so this recovery is happening in the service sector, in manufacturing, in trade, but not in construction. So construction is really hit by higher interest rates, by very high construction prices, but the rest of the economy is recovering. Now, how about prices? Prices, as we all know and feel, have been increasing, and that's an issue because what people have to spend is partly eaten up by inflation. And what I show you here is also from our company survey. So we ask companies, what do you expect for your own pricing? Are you going to increase prices or are prices going down? And what you see here is really a historic surge after the pandemic. Inflation has come, a massive surge in price expectations, but since the turn of the year, this is going down again. So there is a certain relief, a hope that we have the maximum of inflation rates behind us. Now, let's take a look at the travel industry. So this is the Business Climate Index for the travel industry, and what you see here is 15 years or 17 years, and I show you this because, the business climate is going up and down, as you're aware, but what we have here is really historic. So it's historic turbulence. Maybe that's no surprise to you because you work in this industry, and the industry went through the pandemic. It's been a terrible time with a lot of fluctuations, but we haven't had that kind of volatility and shock for decades. It's really a unique event. You see here, now let's zoom in on what's going on recently. So this was the climate in the travel industry before the pandemic, and then, the pandemic came, as you know, and especially the answer to the question, what is the current business situation, was really very bleak for some time. So minus 100 basically means everybody says it's terrible, okay? And it's no surprise that everybody said that in the pandemic. And here, the blue line, the expectations, so companies have been expecting during the pandemic that things will get better, but they didn't get better for a surprisingly long time. But now, things have improved interestingly through this terrible year 2022. But, okay, the war was one thing, but fortunately the pandemic is fading away, so things are getting better. And here, okay, some wobbles in the autumn, but now the business climate is getting better. So what these numbers tell us is that, yes, the travel industry is optimistic at the moment and is expecting a good year, maybe a better year than the average of the economy. Okay, now let's move to these great transformations this Congress is about. What are these transformations? I mentioned them: demographic challenge, decarbonization, the general issue of sustainability, digitization, and the fact that Europe is lagging behind in digitization, behind China, for instance, and behind the US. Now, let's take a very brief look at how we have managed these great transformations. And just as an example, let's take a look at decarbonization. So have we made progress in decarbonization? And we will take a look at our energy system, because that is not just electricity, but all the energy we consume. And what you see in this graph is a comparison of the EU regarding its structure of primary energy use in the last 30 years. So if we have made progress in our transformation, we should have moved away from fossil fuels and move towards renewables or nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is disputed, but it doesn't emit CO2. Okay, and what we see here is that, yes, there has been some progress. So renewables were 5% of our energy consumption 30 years ago, and now they are 15%. But apart from that, oil is still dominating, and we have reduced coal and increased gas. But if you look at that, it took us 30 years to get to 15% of renewables. Now, this looks a little worse than it is, because renewables are more efficient in using this primary energy, okay? So it's not quite as bad. But still, our plan is, in Europe, our plan is to do the remaining 85% within 20 years. We've done 15% in 30 years, and the remaining the remaining 85% we want to do in 20 years. It's very challenging. It probably won't work, that's my view, but we should at least try to make progress. Okay, so I'm showing you this to remind you that we haven't been doing so greatly in this transformation in Europe. Sometimes we think of ourselves, especially in Germany, that we have made a lot of progress. We haven't. There's a lot that remains to do. Now, let's take a look at how we manage these transformations, and I'd just like to mention one thing here, the so-called EU taxonomy on sustainable finance. Now, this sounds very technical. What is it? I have the definition here. So the EU taxonomy is a classification system establishing a list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. The EU taxonomy would provide companies, investors, and policymakers with appropriate definitions for which economic activities can be considered environmentally sustainable. So what does it all mean? It means the EU has come up with the idea to create a list of activities, and we will tell banks and investment funds that this list is the list of activities they should finance. It's basically a list to guide financial decisions of policymakers, banks. This sounds good, but when you think about it, in a market economy, we normally don't do lists of economic activities and then classify them and say, we will finance some and we won't finance others. That's something you do in a planned economy. Okay, in a planned, for instance, in the Soviet Union, they did lists of economic activities and then said, this activity gets that much money and so on. Normally, in a market economy, you don't do that. right? And as you would think, we have drawn up this list now in a political process, and there is a lot of debate, for instance, about whether defense is sustainable. A lot of people thought, no, we don't want defense, it's not sustainable, but now we see we badly need it, we better do it. So in a market economy, you normally do environmental policy by looking, for instance, at CO2 emissions, by regulating the problem, not by drawing up lists, endless lists of economic activities, because when you've done the list, the economy has changed already, and you can throw away the list. Okay, so I'm mentioning this because I think we do not have a very smart approach in Europe for managing this transition towards sustainability. I mean, this leads to a lot of bureaucracy because people are now starting to measure sustainability. It's impossible, but you can employ a lot of people doing it. The Q4, the big four consulting firms, they will need a lot of people measuring or checking whether your company does the things on this list. Does this help the environment? No, it doesn't. It produces a lot of bureaucracy. So we need to get better at managing this transformation as many others. Let's take a look at digitization. I mean, this is a very complex field with all kinds of issues arising, but there are people trying to summarize to what extent economies have made progress towards digitization. And here you see a list, and countries like Germany, Spain, Italy, the large European countries, they are kind of okay. They are not great, they are kind of okay in digitization, but the countries leading here is in particular the US. So we need to make more progress. It's not that it's impossible, In this list, if you look at Denmark, it's a European country, and it's on the top of the list. So Denmark, at least according to this index, has made a lot of progress. So we can do it, but we need to be quicker, and we need to get better at this. Okay, so we haven't done greatly in these transformation. Maybe okay. Maybe sometimes one is disappointed. And now the question is, what is the impact of the current crisis, so the energy crisis? Okay, we've been dealing with these transformations, but now we hit by this crisis. And on the right-hand side, you now see what the crisis brings. So we have an increase in energy prices in Europe, especially natural gas prices. So we've been buying all this gas from the Russians. Now we won't do it anymore. But our plan was we would need the gas to manage the transition towards renewable energies. Now we have a lot less gas, and we need to come up with new ideas. We do a lot of foreign trade, but now we face trade frictions because we want to do less trade with China. So what does it mean? And of course, we face a higher defense burden now. We will need to do something about it. Just one couple of numbers here regarding the idea to do less trade in the future. Some people say we should reshore or nearshore our activities, so we should produce more at home. I mean, you are from the travel industry and from the tourism industry, so for your industry it's inevitable to do trade with faraway countries. It's quite normal and nothing you want to change. But in manufacturing, for instance, a lot of people are saying let's produce more at home. So the summary here of this study is it's very expensive if you do that. You better don't. It's better to diversify trade, maybe do trade not just with suppliers from China, but also with suppliers from other countries, but don't get stuck and focus only on nearshoring here. For instance, if we did nearshoring, that means take back production to the EU and neighboring countries. It would reduce German GDP by 3%, so it's not a very good idea. Now, the current crisis brings all kinds of problems. Does it also bring new opportunities? Yes, it does. Some people say, okay, now that fossil fuels are so expensive and we don't get the gas anymore, maybe it's an opportunity to accelerate this decarbonization, which we need to accelerate anyway if we want to get, as we've seen, anywhere near our climate objectives. Yes, but the idea was that this transition away from coal and oil would use gas, okay, until we have built up renewable energies using hydrogens, for instance. So in a way, yes, this is a chance to accelerate, but the lack of gas is also a problem for this transformation. So basically, we need to change the plan of transforming the energy system. How about migration? So the current crisis, especially the food crisis, the current crisis is not just affecting energy prices, it's also affecting food prices. And people, especially from Africa, but also from parts of Asia, will migrate, will leave their countries because they are under pressure. And in a way, this is a problem for Europe. We know that migration and illegal migration is a problem, but it's also an opportunity because there are people coming and they can be integrated into the labor market. So there is an opportunity here. We just have to use it. And again, it's not clear we are really positioned to use it efficiently. This industry, the tourism industry, is an industry that plays a key role in integrating migrants. You know, there are employment opportunities for migrants in hotels and restaurants in the tourism industry, but we really need to use that. So have our legislation and all of that ready to integrate these people. Yeah, and then you know, there is more conflict in the world now with Russia, with China, but there's maybe also more cooperation in the world. So we have been reminded that we need at least to cooperate with the US, but maybe also with more other countries to face the Chinese and Russian threat. So maybe that's also an opportunity leading us to cooperate better in the West. Now, what do all these trends and what does this outlook mean for the travel industry? Here are some thoughts very briefly. So first of all, the current economic crisis leads to pressures, as I'm sure you know, on disposable incomes. So the energy prices have grown, food prices have grown, and now other things are getting more expensive. I mean, we all hopefully get higher salaries, but the salary increases will be lower than inflation. So our real incomes will be lower. How does that affect travel budgets? It's an interesting question. You know that better than I do, but my impression is that people haven't been traveling as they wanted for years now, so they are ready to spend more on travel, even if their overall budget are under pressure. So my expectation would be willingness to spend on travel is there, but maybe what's needed is also flexibility in offering products with different budgets, maybe with smaller budgets and more flexible budgets. Demographic change increases demand for tourism, clearly, because there is the baby boomer generation to which many of us here in the room belong, and as we grow older, we have hopefully saved and we want to travel. So there is a huge generation in the developed world that wants to travel more, and that's an opportunity. So the tourism industry is a growth industry just because there are these elderly people coming on the market. So again, you know more about travel management than I do, but I would certainly direct products to this aging but affluent generation of baby boomers who, they're expected to work longer, but they don't want to work longer because they want to travel more. So there is an opportunity here, but it's about people in the age between, let's say, 55 and 80. So how do they travel? That's part of the future of the tourism industry. Sustainability and decarbonization is a big issue. Sustainability in travel, it's something that is standard now. People don't want to put too much of a burden on the environment. At the same time, our companies, and that's also true for the travel industry, are facing more and more bureaucratic pressures because there's a lot of reporting that is expected about sustainability, I would say, of limited usefulness. But we face this bureaucracy, and there's hardly a way around it. And finally, I mentioned that if we think about demographic change, I think demographic change for the industry is a risk because, as far as I can see, the potential for automation, which is one response, if you don't have enough people, you invest in automation, and my impression is potential for automation in the travel industry is limited because it's a service industry, and at the same time, you have this advantage of being more easily able to integrate migrants. Again, that's a positive thing. So that's at least some pieces of good news for the industry, and I hope in the short term, but also in the medium term, you will be able to exploit that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Clemens Fuest. It was impressive. If we listen in a very detailed way, I think that we can learn a lot about consequences for tourism and hospitality. Thank you very much, Professor Fuest. Coming back to the global level, we see, you stated it in a clear way, a worldwide decline in economic growth. We see a lot of crises, and you mentioned the demographic crisis especially. We know all about the so-called future of work, labor shortage in many, many different economies and sectors. On the other hand, you described this crisis, especially the demographic crisis, as a chance, as a potential opportunity for tourism and hospitality. But just coming back to the worldwide situation, this is basically a more negative than positive outlook, I would say. As a consequence, for tourism and hospitality, what is your impression? Next to the fact that potentially the product can go towards, let me say, a development of special products for elder people, for people becoming older and older. Yeah? But looking at the economic growth and looking at the political situation, we have these big regional blocks, the Asian Pacific bloc, the Americas, Africa, Europe, redefining and re-establishing the relations between these blocks. So what is your impression, the general impression about future of tourism and hospitality?
Well, I think if we remind ourselves of this 15 or 20-year graph I showed you with this high degree of, or relatively high degree of stability, so the world as it was before 2019, and then the fluctuations, our hope, of course, and our expectation is that we will get back to a world which is more stable. But I think we need to prepare ourselves for a scenario where we don't. A scenario where we don't get back to these more stable conditions, but stay in a more volatile environment. Hopefully not as volatile as it was in the last 3 years, but more volatile with stronger price movements and more frequent crises. Some people say the next pandemic will come more quickly than we might expect. I hope it isn't, but or the next energy crisis, there are these looming conflicts you mentioned. So I think for us, and I'm sure for the travel industry, which is vulnerable, especially to international conflicts, I think preparing for that is very important. What does it mean? It means the ability to adjust very quickly from having a normal business situation to having a restricted business situation where you need adjustments of personnel, resources, where you need financial resilience. I think that is the task for the future, to be more flexible and, everybody says that, more resilient, which means you can adjust to crisis and then come back very quickly. So not just, shut down part of your business, but also come back quickly when it's necessary. So I would expect we need a lot more flexibility and maybe also produce products that are less affected by these crises. Parts of the tourism industry, like, going hiking in the mountains was doable in the pandemic. And other things are more vulnerable. Also thinking about this dimension in the product portfolio, which part of the portfolio is more vulnerable to these shocks, because I'm afraid we will see more shocks because countries, as you say, don't cooperate as much anymore, and there will be more conflicts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess this was very, very important to underline the role of resilience. Yeah? We are talking about robustness. And you mentioned the high vulnerability of tourism and hospitality sectors. And this is really true. That's what we saw during the pandemic. So one is saying that tourism and hospitality are a kind of indicator of trust of economies, politics, and societies. Would you confirm that? You are an economist. You know that trust is so important for the development of economies. Can tourism and hospitality have a special role in that regard?
They certainly can, and they do. Indeed, trust is unbelievably important, because if we move around the world, if you think about all the products you consume, how you move through the day, you almost never fully understand what's going on. I don't understand how this microphone works exactly. I don't understand all the technical things when I travel here. And when you go on holidays, I mean, you simply trust that the company prepares, that it's reasonable, secure. And to the extent that this trust is called into question, we have a problem. If you remember the financial crisis, it was also a trust crisis. Normally you don't think every day, well, is my bank actually solvent? Will I get my money back, or will it be lost? Because the tourism industry is so exposed to travel restrictions, things countries suddenly do, it is maybe an indicator, really, of how, especially cross-country cooperation works, and to what extent we can trust on our institutions and this cooperation working.
Yeah, thank you. So tourism and hospitality as an industry transporting trust, probably so important for the world economy, for the development of societies, and definitely also for the development of political circumstances. Coming back to resilience, you mentioned that the importance of adaptation capabilities, of flexibility. We have this vulnerability. Sometimes I would say that the impression is that we all dream to go back to the years we experienced as very, very positive years, 2018, 2019. So in the resilience language, we would say bounce back. Bounce back on one hand, bounce forward on the other hand. So the big transformation you described today will shift us towards a new future. So how deal with this bounce back and bounce forward, let me say, resilience policy? We need flexibility, no doubt, but we need also new products. And there is one question here. What do you think could be windows of opportunity for tourism in the transformation process? Thank you very much for questions via Slido.
I think the opportunity is really to be more agile than competitors and generally agile in understanding the way people change. We discussed the baby boomers coming on the market, but there are many new things. So there are people who want to, you know this better than I, the changes in interest, who want to travel, do shorter trips, maybe nicer trips. And I think this really is a time for innovation. So a lot of people work differently today. Their lives are different, and how do you adjust to that? What is the product people want in this new world, where people have a little less trust, as we have discussed, or are a little more worried about things that may happen? They are more worried about political conflicts. So do they really want to travel to China, or do they really want to travel to other places near crisis? Maybe not. So how does the tourism industry react? People want to live more sustainably, but the degree to which they are ready to sacrifice comfort is limited, I would say. Yeah. So how do you think about that? Is this just a marketing thing, or do you also offer a substance here? I guess many of these adjustments will also have to be tried out. So experimenting, I think, is a strategy each company should embrace. Just experiment with the new clients and see how they react. So use this time for innovation. In a way, I guess the message is don't build back as before, but build back differently.
Yeah. Thank you. So one aspect is resilience, but the other one is, you mentioned it in your presentation, sustainability. And you were talking about this bureaucracy, the increasing bureaucracy in the context of sustainability, the taxonomy especially. Yeah? So from the political level, we have this, let me say, the shift forward, probably in the right way, to increase the pressure towards sustainability. But on the other hand, the bureaucracy is also increasing. So in terms of the global economy, Europe is in a not weak but not strong position. Yeah? Now we shift forward towards this sustainability policy. What will be the consequence on a worldwide scale? And at the end, then the question for us is always the consequence for tourism.
I think at the general level, we all agree that we want to live more sustainably. I mean, we all know that climate change is maybe the biggest global threat, so we want to do something about it. But we really have to be aware, I think, regarding our politicians, but also our companies. I mean, I hear a lot of companies repeating what the politicians tell us, things like, oh, this sustainability is great. And I think the real danger is that we do produce a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of new rules, a lot of certificates about sustainability. We do a lot of greenwashing, as people say. So we pretend we are greener because we have a new green certificate. And the danger is that if we really look at what's happening, we are not becoming very much greener. And that's because in this entire sustainability regulation movements, we are looking at very general, complicated things, but we are not looking at what counts. CO2 emissions, we really have to reduce them. I mean, we can go on talking about sustainability for a long time and have a lot of lists and pacts and legislation, but we need to be careful because I think my impression is we are devoting a lot of resources to this bureaucracy. I meet a lot of young people, maybe some of you are also burdened with this. I meet a lot of young people when I ask them what you do, whom I know from university, and they tell me, oh, I'm at this and that company and I measure sustainability. And I always wonder, does anybody still produce useful things, or do we all do this bureaucracy? So I really think we need to be critical. And ask critical questions. We have a tendency to say, oh, if someone talks about sustainability, it must be good. And it isn't. So I think there really is this danger of bureaucratization and greenwashing, and we need to focus on the real problems, preserving the natural environment. What are we doing to preserve the rainforest, really? How many square kilometers are we cutting down? I mean, these lists of activities don't help us. We need to go to these issues more directly.
That means that we have to we have to be serious as an industry, and not just follow only bureaucratic frames, but we have to increase our, let me say, our energies and passions to do that what you expressed just right now. Yeah? So thank you very much for this. The last question, or one of the last questions, thank you very much again for using Slido. Looking at the migration, you mentioned migration as a crisis, but especially as a chance, an opportunity. Migration to Europe might be an opportunity for businesses here, but it drains the labor market in global South countries. Is this a new crisis in the making? So on one hand, crisis, on the other hand, chance and opportunity. We all know that tourism and hospitality are highly depending by workforce. Tomorrow we will have an own track about workforce. So this is the, let me say, the important, the crucial element when we talk about vulnerability, human resources. So looking at trust, coming back to the issue of trust, without people, and tourism is a people business, without people, no trust. So how could we manage this? How could we solve these problems in the next couple of years?
It's true, migration, when people come to us and migrate to Europe, they are leaving their home countries, and this can be a problem for their home countries. This is even a problem within Europe. I remember a Polish ambassador telling me when I asked her, why are so many people in Poland critical about the EU? She told me, look, for a lot of our people, the EU, it is the motorways on which the young people left for the West. So it's this experience that migration within Europe leaves countries behind. You know, they're only the old people staying at home, and for them, this is a very negative experience. And if we think about the global South, and migration from the global south, it's often the elites that are leaving. So younger people, agile people, intelligent people who want to achieve something in life. And they are leaving these countries, and that can be a problem. My view is that this European and maybe particularly German view that we need to rescue the origin countries is maybe a bit too much. So we are overburdening ourselves. For this industry, I think it is true that the industry does play and maybe is one of the opportunities to stabilize the origin countries, because I suppose if countries are reasonably stable politically, developing the tourism industry is, of course, the big opportunity for all of these countries in the global south. It's part of their future. So this industry does play a key role and maybe has a realistic option of doing something for these countries. But us, the Europeans, stabilizing countries in Africa to prevent migration, yes, it's a good idea. It sounds great, but we shouldn't overburden ourselves. So I think we should be more modest, and maybe one way of really achieving something for these countries is developing individual industries like the tourism industry. That's something concrete. You know, we can maybe we can cooperate with them or partially help them to develop certain industries, and then if we develop businesses there, yes, people will stay. But maybe we should also focus more on integrating these people here. Well, it's difficult enough politically. It's not so easy educating these people when they come here when it's necessary. Maybe we should focus on that and not try to at the same time save the whole world. It's not going to work.
Yeah. One question which is more related to a typical economic context: what about inflation? We all feel the consequences of inflation. Do you have any recommendations for tourism experts and entrepreneurs how to deal with? Do they have now to increase the prices? Do we go towards tourism and hospitality sector as a luxury sector because everything will become more expensive? Is that the logic, or do we have to handle the inflation in a different way? Or would you even say, well, keep cool because inflation rates will go down?
Well, it would be very ambitious if I tried to tell the managers how to do their business, but my expectation would be, I think that's part of the world that has changed. So my expectation is that inflation will not return to the levels we have seen. Why not? Because we have these labor shortages, because trade is going to be more difficult. We've talked about the trade frictions. This will make things more expensive and permanently so. We have these political tensions. We have decarbonization. Decarbonization is a thing where we tear down one kind of power plant and build another one that does the same. Okay, so this will direct resources into this transformation, which is important for the climate, but it reduces our ability to produce other goods. And that will drive inflation. So I'm afraid we will live in a time of higher inflation rates, and that means, yes, you have to adjust prices, and you have to think about customers with squeezed budgets. Maybe next year, maybe in 23, people will still say, I haven't been traveling for so long, so I do this trip, what the hell, so it doesn't matter even if I don't have the money. But in 24, this will not be repeated. These budget constraints will bite, and at least in Europe, people will be a little poorer. I, as a non-specialist in tourism, I would say I would create a few products that are where you don't have to spend so much. So make the trip a little shorter, bring down, offer a menu of things. Maybe there are people who say, okay, the hotel doesn't have to be 4-star, it's okay if it's 3-star, and so more budget-oriented things. But then also we have this group of the baby boomers, and yes, they are affected by inflation, but they have money, they have savings. And I think many of them say, okay, if I spend a little more on travel, my children will inherit less. That's a pity, but what can I do? So I think there will also be clients. I mean, to some extent, and you're aware of that, we do have a polarization. So we have one group of the population, I would say, some of the baby boomers who do have money and a lot of money and who want luxury and don't look at the prices. And then you also have increasingly people who don't have the money and who need completely different products. families and so on. So it'll be more diversified.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was a great summary of this first session today. Thank you very much for the questions. And I guess that Professor Fuest now also in his summary he took account of this specific questions, the role of individualization, the windows of opportunity for tourism and the transformation process as a whole. He gave us really important and interesting answers. This is, in German we would say, Steilvorlage. This was a great starting discussion for ITB Convention and the ITB as a whole. Thank you very much, Professor Fuest.
Thank you.